All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I did just go through some housekeeping, but we are having some folks join us as I'm actively doing the housekeeping. So I'll just go ahead and say it again. If you would please be so kind as to keep your video cameras turned off and your microphones muted. That way we don't interrupt Andrea while she is talking. And this is a recorded session, so if there is something mentioned today that you would like to go back and revisit, it will be posted up on the YouTube channel later on today, and we also will make a PDF version of the talk available on the GBatNet website. So if you see something intriguing today, feel free to go back. And I'm pretty sure that that Andrea is. I think did you put your contact information at the end, or if someone
I
has
can send it. Yeah, through the chat.
So if there's anything that you would want to know more about dietary diversity today, I'm sure Andrea would be happy to get in contact with folks. But without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, newly PhD candidate Andrea Bernal Rivera, and she is also one of our GBatNet student representatives. So she has been working with GBatNet for years now, I think, in one way or another. Uh, Before becoming a student representative, you were already getting involved.
Yeah.
So she's absolutely brilliant and is going to be doing a really awesome talk for us today. So without further ado, I will pass off the controls to Andrea. So thank you so much for joining us. And again, feel free to put in where you are tuning in from into the chat so we know where everyone's coming from. All right, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dana, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today in my talk. So just for you to know, the talk from today, it's gonna be kind of like a review of the field of dietary diversity, focusing a little bit into the adaptations that different bats with different diets have to kind of like acquire and process the food that they eat. Um, so there's a lot of different research that I'm gonna be citing. You're gonna be seeing all this in like citations and little QR codes. So if you're interested in seeing one of these papers, you can just basically scan the QR code and it will take you to the research. And yeah, these investigations have been made by awesome researchers, some that are my friends. So it's like really cool. That I will be able to talk about it today, and you can all visit their work. Okay, so my talk today is entitled Buffet for Bats, a Feast of Dietary Diversity. And well, let's just get started. So, a little bit about me. My name is Andrea. I'm a Colombian biologist, and I have been working with bats for around 8 years. I mostly work with ecophysiology of bats. I'm a research associate at the Calima Foundation for conservation in the tropics, and I'm doing my PhD at the University of Washington with Dr. Charlene Santana and Dr. Alejandro Rico Guevara. And as Dana said, I'm part of GBatNet, and I'm one of the student representative of this Global Union of Bat Diversity Networks. Um, a little bit more. I mostly work with mammals. So I've been working with mammals from different orders, so marsupials and rodents, and a little bit with primates. But I mostly work with bats. I basically love them, and they are like so fascinating to me. I've been working regarding the ecosystem services that bats provide in certain ecosystems, learning about their taxonomy, also physiology and metabolism related work. Also work with bats to try to kind of like push for conservation strategies and also outreach. And I did mostly these in my hometown, and this is a picture that you can see down there. Where we just go to the street and talk to people about bats. And it's really fascinating to see like the public spaces and like, what? we have bats in this city and they are not all vampires. So it's really cool to see the reactions. And right now I'm also doing some outreach here where I'm based now, so in Seattle. Through the Burke Museum, which is a museum that is associated to the University of Washington. Okay, so the agenda today is that we're going to start talking about dietary diversity, a little bit of background, then a little bit about ecosystem services associated to this dietary diversity, then the adaptations that these bats have to their diet in terms of their morphology, their sensory system, their behavior, and their physiology. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, which is tied into the interplay between physiology and morphology. So to start, somewhere where it's maybe familiar, the dietary evolutions of bats happened from, we think, an organism that was mostly consuming insects. And then from this, today now, we see this huge dietary diversity that bats exhibit. So insects are consumed in most of the families. And sometimes some species of these families are going to be the ones just eating a little bit of insects and then having mostly a diet based on fruits or nectars. There are some species that are carnivorous too, and there's some species that are hematophagous or that they feed on blood. However, the family Phyllostomidae is the one that has the most dietary diversity, having insectivorous species, carnivorous, frugivorous, nectarivorous, and the sanguinivorous bats. And here you can see a little bit of phylogenetic tree showing the relationships of these species. In this case, the genera of multiple taxa in this Phyllostomidae family, and we can see in blue insectivorous species, then in purple some of the carnivorous species, in red the hematophagous species, in yellow the nectar-feeding bats, and then in green the frugivorous species. So this dietary diversity is huge, as you can see also in these pictures. And we know that there's more than 1,400 bat species. Around 70% of them are insectivores, and they can eat 50 to 100% of their body weight in insects every night, some a little bit more of that. And we also know that there's only 3 species that feed on blood. One mostly blood of mammals, like wild mammals like I don't know tapirs or also deers, but they also go and feed on blood of like horses, like yeah, cattle. And then the other 2 species mostly feed on blood of birds, as you can see one here in this picture. However, as we recognize that there are like different categories of diet, these are mainly just broad categories that we use in they are basically useful for categorization and work, but we also acknowledge that diet is a continuum and some species that might eat nectar or fruits. Sometimes when these resources are not fully available, they have a shift in their diet and they start eating insects, or maybe species that eat insects also can incorporate a little bit of vertebrates in their diet. So this is just not black and white. This is basically a continuum. So since this is also a continuum, these bats are gonna be kind of like providing many ecosystem services related to what they eat. So frugivorous bats are gonna be mainly contributing with seed dispersal, and this is gonna be helping to regenerate forest, for example. The insectivorous bats provide pest control. And this is super useful for maintaining our crops and our survival depend on this. And then the nectar feeding bats also help with pollination. So they go to the flower, they get some of the pollen, they visit another flower, and then they pollinate. And thanks to these, we have many of the fruits that we eat today. So these are basically really important ecosystem services, and the omnivorous bats are going to be helping us with many of these tasks too. So this is just a couple videos of bats in action. So we have an insectivorous bat eating a little mealworm here. We also have frugivores, um, like this one, and it's just eating a little bit of fruit, and they just basically turn it as us eating corn. So it's really pretty to see. And then we also have nectar feeding bats that just hover in front of the flowers. They just take a little bit of nectar and they just quickly leave after kind of like leaking the nectar out of the flower. So we know that there are more than 500 plant species, depending on bat for their pollination. And this is like crucial for these plant reproduction and for us to have some of the fruits that are gonna be the result of this pollination. And also these fruits are gonna be consumed by other organisms, so not only humans depend on the bats for this. And also the pest control made by bats is estimated to be over $3.7 billion per year in the US. So this is huge. There's some other calculations that go up to $53 billion. So it's crazy, and they're basically these heroes that we need at night that will keep our crops just healthy for us to eat and yeah, to survive. This is something really cool. This is a resource that is showing the enormous contribution of bats to the ecosystems and to our lives. So here, you can see the resource, and it's basically really fun because it shows, kind of like the different contributions of bats in terms of seed dispersal or pest control. So for example, here, if we look at the grapes, it's telling us which species eat many insects from like the grape crops. And this is also going to translate into having good wine, for example. So this is a really fun resource that I encourage you to look at. And maybe you can, if you do bad outreach or if you just want to tell your friends some really fun facts about bats, you can have them here for sure. Okay, and here's a little bit of examples of ecosystem services and bats used for conservation purposes. And these are a couple of works that I was involved in when I was in Colombia. So one of them was looking at the ecosystem services provided by bats in this very at-risk ecosystem that it's the dry tropical forest ecosystem. And basically, we looked at which bat species were in the area and what they were doing, if they were eating pollen or nectar or fruits. And then these inform some of the plans for restoration with native plants to kind of like help the bats and also help us by having the bats in this ecosystem, which are like surrounded and mainly many people lived in there. So it's just to help the ecosystem as a whole. And then we also, by knowing which species are in a locality, in an area, and what the community of the bats look like, we can propose this and as conservation values. And these could help kind of like process and make new existing protected areas based on all the benefits that we get from bats, basically. So now let's change gears a little bit and let's talk about the adaptations of bats to their diet. And this is going to be in the case of morphology, sensory system, behavior, and physiology. So let's start with morphology, and I'll be talking about tongues, skulls, teeth, and some other soft tissue, so the pancreas, and how these are related to diet. So we can start by talking about the tongues of the bats. Here in the left, you can see this really long flower with this really long enclosed corolla. And basically this bat is the one that pollinates that flower and is like the one able to reach the nectar at the bottom of this flower because it has a super long tongue that you can see right here. And researchers have found that they have kind of like this tongue retractor that is helping the bat to basically use its tongue to feed and then pollinate this plant. So this is pretty impressive. Um, Here is a little video of a little tiny bat, a Glossophaga, just drinking some sugar water. And here you can see how they leak the nectar. This is basically similar to how dogs drink water. However, they have these special structures in their tongue that you can see down here that are called like hair-like papillae. And here in the top, you will see how they protrude the tongue and then retract it, and then these papillae are going to be capturing the nectar that the tongue just touched. This is going to go to their mouth, and this is how they will ingest this nectar, right? Um, so this is again the video where they are just licking the nectar. And here in the right, you can see a graph of the times that they insert the tongue in the nectar. So this is a lot for this species, which is in this subfamily called Glossophaginae. However, there's another subfamily where we see nectarivory, and it's called Oncophilinae. And it is known that they use their tongue as a straw, as you can see in this other video. So they don't have to insert their tongue as many times as these other species up here. So they just insert it a couple times, and that's enough for them to drink the nectar. And I'm playing it again. So yeah, just using the tongue as a straw. They just have some grooves in their tongues, and this is how the nectar is going to reach their mouths. So this is pretty cool to see too. A little bit more about tongues. There's in omnivorous bats, researchers have found that they have different types of papillae. And since they also feed a lot of on nectar, they have these hair-like papillae too in some areas of their tongue. So this is basically also helping them to have kind of like this shifts in diet and still extract some nectar out of the flowers that they visit. They also have really long tongues, so it's really cool. This is an awesome researcher. I encourage you to look at it. And then here on the right, we have this really new paper that came out about tongues in insectivorous bats and how they have this lobe here at the end of the tongue. And in some species, this is like bigger and is mostly the species that are like high-speed aerial hunters of insects. And they also have these little papillae here that are pointing out. And it seems that this is basically helping them to capture the insects like right there and get some of the particles of the insects right there because they are just going to catch them really fast while they're flying. So this is another really interesting adaptation to what they eat. Now let's talk a little bit about skulls. So here we have the different morphologies of the skulls based on what these bats eat and how they look also. So in nectarivorous bats, we're gonna see really long rostrums. And this is going to basically help them to have their tongue right there, ready for its use. Then the insectivorous bats have like shorter rostrums and more robust skulls to crush the insects. But then also in frugivorous, what we can see in some of these species is that they have shorter rostrums, and this is especially helping this species that is right there, Centuria, to bite and on really hard fruits. A little bit more on skulls. So here, the skull morphology is related to the dietary hardness. And something that is really cool to see is how in the purple, the very hard diets here of these species are going to be related to also shortening a little bit the rostrum. So they have more force to bite on, let's say, vertebrates or really hard fruits. This is really cool too. Now talking about the molar morphology and how it reflects bad diet, we can see that some species here that are the insectivorous ones are going to show some of the kind of like the top of the molar being in a W shaped. This is gonna help them crush the insects they eat. And then in frugivores, what we're gonna see is that they're like a little bit flatter and they have like more area so they can chew on the fruit that they eat. So teeth morphology is also reflecting that diet. Here you can see a phylogeny where it's color coded by their diet, and it's related to the teeth on the jaw of the bats. And what I really like to see from here is that in nectar feeding bats that are down there in the right, um, basically they have like reduced teeth. Since they are nectar feeding bats, they are mostly eating nectar, so they are not chewing on insects as much as an omnivorous or an insectivorous bat, and they are not chewing as much in fruit as frugivorous. So here we have this reduction on like their teeth. And this is also impacting the jaw length of these bats, and they show some length reduction and teeth loss. And this is also related to diet. So in insectivorous bats, for example, here in blue, we can see like a regular jaw with three premolars and three molars that are well developed. While in frugivorous bats, down here, for example, we see shorter jaws, and they just have two premolars and three molars, and many of these species have this third molar just being very reduced. So this is also really, really cool research from a friend that you can basically go and see here in this QR code. Okay, here there's a little bit more on jaw shape diversity and diet. And what I really like from these photos is that you can see that in frugivores, you have these jaws that are like more circular, more rounded right here. Than, for example, a species that eat insects or a species that have fluid diets. So this is really cool to see how these structures can be so diverse. And the bonus in the morphology part here on external structures is the fishing bat. And we can see that they have these huge feet with huge claws. And this is basically just helping the bat to grab the fish out of the lakes where they hunt and then basically take it to its mouth. And we can see also that they have these special cheeks here where they can put some of the food that they just ingested. So this is also really cool adaptation. Now, in soft tissue, we can see differences in the pancreas morphology also across diets. And this is important because the pancreas have these pancreas islets that are here, kind of like pointed out with these arrows. And they are crucial for the production of hormones that are just basically what we need for nutrient metabolism and maintaining our blood glucose levels. And what these researchers found is that in insectivores and frugivores, so rich sugar diet bats, they have more of the pancreatic beta cells, which are the ones that are going to be producing insulin. And this is going to be basically helping lowering the blood glucose levels in our blood and taking this glucose kind of like inside the cells where energy is needed. And then, however, in insectivores and hematophagous bats, maybe there's a little bit more of alpha cells, and these alpha cells are going to be producing glucagon. So this is basically going to have a signal telling the organism that the liver needs to produce glucose to maintain these blood glucose levels, kind of like stable. So these are also really cool adaptations to see at the microscopic level involving adaptations to the diet. Okay, now we can talk a little bit about the sensory system, mostly about sensing odors, hearing, kind of like looking, and also sensing temperature. And this sensory system, it's gonna vary, and we expect it to vary for finding different food resources. So maybe insectivorous bats use some senses more than others, and this is different from what nectar feeding bats do, for example. So we will start here with the ability of echolocation. And here we can see in this phylogeny that some bats could have like known echolocation right here, for example, in the Theropodida family, but some others would have nasal echolocation or oral echolocation, and this is basically kind of like help the bats to locate their sources and navigate in different ways. So in Theropodida, for example, they would be mostly using their sight to look for food resources, for example. However, in some of these insectivorous bats that echolocate nasally and some of these other bats that echolocate orally, then they are going to use the sound to locate their food sources and navigate. And there's a lot of research coming from this side, and it's like pretty excited. And there's a PhD student in my lab working on it, so stay tuned. Also, we have other perception, and other perception is mainly done by the olfactory receptors or and this is basically very cool to see. Here in this plot, we have the Phylostomida family. And the researchers found a unique olfactory receptor pattern linked to the frugivorous diet of these New World fruit-eating bats. So frugivores are here in blue, non-frugivores are here in green. And we can see that there's like a strong association between the niche specialization by being frugivores and this olfactory receptor diversity. So some bats also will be using other perception more than others to find their food sources. And also we have vision, so dichromatic and UV vision. And there's a lot going on here. There are like different cones for sensing different wavelengths or like colors, and UV in the case of the S cones. And these patterns seem to change between species and between diets, but it's really, really cool to see. And what the researchers found is that vision is a highly evolvable trait that repeatedly and rapidly change in response to diverse selective demands. And there's a lot of research also going on here to see if this is basically helping the bats to find some food sources, or maybe it's mostly useful for social communication. Who knows? So this is also really cool, and there is some really awesome researchers working on it. So stay tuned. And now we have thermoperception. And this is basically what we're gonna see in vampire bats. They have these nasal pits that are around their nose, and this is gonna help them to detect infrared radiation. So they can use this when they're like closer to their prey. So let's say a pig, and they are just approaching, and they can detect the prey's heat body and where they might be more blood flowing. So it will be better to eat from this side. So they will just make a little cut with their teeth and then lick the blood and then just fly away. And then the prey is gonna continue with his life. And now we have a little bit of behavior. I mean, this is more locomotion ways that they have. So vampire bats not only fly, but they can also kind of like jump, run. And this is really cool to see in this video. So this is going to be mainly helping the bats to get closer to their prey and yeah, being also silent, like not flying around the prey and being able to just go closer without being noticed. And also there's this behavior of food sharing that probably Dr. Jerry Carter is gonna tell you about next month. And it's basically that the vampire bats regurgitate a portion of its food to share it with other vampire bats. And this is gonna basically maintain them both alive because you're pretty sensitive to starvation and fasting. And now we have this other locomotion way, which is hovering in nectar beds. This is basically just gonna help them to be stable in front of the flower. And I'm gonna play it again because that's really fast. So this is basically the bat flying in a slow motion, and it's still fast. And this is the real speed. So they're just going to be basically super, super fast at it, just drinking a little bit of the nectar, flying away before a predator can catch them. So they just drink the nectar right there. However, there are other bats that take the food to go, like this frugivore, just landing, taking the fruit and flying away and eating it somewhere else, or this fishing bat, just getting the fish out of the pond and then going and eating it somewhere else. And now we can talk a little bit about their physiology, focusing on metabolism, acquiring energy, and how the enzymes breaking down nutrients are going to help the bats to assimilate what they eat. This is really important because based on the diet, there are some nutrients that are present in like a more proportion than others. So for example, in insectivorous, carnivorous, and metaphagous bats, the nutrients that we are going to find are mostly proteins. However, if we look at nectar-feeding bats and fruit bats, what we're mostly going to find are sugars. So just for us to be all on the same page, I'm gonna talk a little bit about intestine. So it's important for us to see what's happening in the intestine. So in the small intestine, which is the most of the proportion that the bats have is a small intestine, basically, then we will find the interior, the inner portion of the intestine, which is going to be called the lumen, and then the nutrients are going to come here. Then they're going to be absorbed through these epithelial cells or enterocytes that are in the intestine. And then these nutrients are going to go to the blood. And then from the blood, the nutrients are going to be transported to the different tissues where energy is needed, basically. So these nutrients are going to be absorbed using different mechanisms. So these little dots and squares that you see here in different colors are going to be enzymes that are going to be helping to break down nutrients. So then the subunits of these nutrients can be absorbed through the intestine. So those are, for example, sucrase and maltase right here. And they are here in the brush border or microvilli of these cells of the enterocytes. And also there are many transporters right here that are going to be taking some of the nutrients from the lumen of the intestine, taking it inside the cells, and then taking it to the blood. But we also have in bats this paracellular transport, which is basically but having nutrients here, and there should be like some really small nutrients, and they can also go through the enterocytes through these tight junctions without needing like active transport, meaning having transporters to take them in. So they could just flow inside and then go to the blood. So this is going to help the bats to kind of like get the job done. But as you can imagine, maybe there are some differences in the enzymes that bats have in their intestine, and maybe some difference in the transporters that bats have in the intestine related to what they eat. So maybe insectivorous or carnivorous bats may have some enzymes that are more related to protein breakdown than, let's say, nectarivorous bats. And this is something that we can see. So talking about enzyme activity, this is just an example that researchers found that regarding the enzyme maltase, which is basically going to work breaking down starch, which is found in plants. The nectarivorous and the frugivorous bats are the ones that show the higher activity of this enzyme, while insectivorous and carnivorous hematophagous bats show the lower activity of this enzyme. So there has been changes on the enzyme activity related to diet, kind of like thinking it from an evolutionary perspective with a shift in diet from insectivory, from the ancestor, to bats that we see right now. So for example, in the case of sucrase and nectar bats, it seems that it was kind of like an increase of this enzyme activity when switching to diets that are kind of like full of sugar. And this is crucial for breaking down the sugar sucrose, like the table sugar. And then there was a decrease in the activity of the enzyme trialase, which is going to be important for breaking down the sugar trehalose, which is found in insects. So having these enzymes are going to be crucial for the bats to break down the nutrients and then acquiring some energy from it, but also not having all these enzymes out there at every time because these might consume a lot of energy too. And now we have some molecular adaptations to specialized diets, and there's really cool research going on in these past years regarding this topic, and it's really cool to see. This is an example on vampire bats, and basically they looked at gene losses to help the bats to be kind of like better at eating blood and surviving on it. And for example, one that I really liked was the gene loss of REP15. And this is related to having higher iron excretion. And this is basically going to be key for vampire bats because they eat a lot of iron in their blood diet. And like these are many research going on regarding molecular adaptations. So if you're interested in it, you should totally check these papers out too. And at the end, like if you want me to go back to one slide because you missed the QR code or something, I could totally do it. And now let's talk a little bit about my research, which is in sugar assimilation in bats with different diets and the interplay between like physiology and morphology. So this is what I focus on for my undergrad and part of my research scholar research. And now I'll continue working on this for my PhD, relate a little bit more with the flexibility of the bat's diet. So what I did was basically in vivo physiology experiments where I was feeding the bats with sugar, different types of sugar separately. So I fed them with glucose or with sucrose, which are mostly found in fruits and nectar. And I also fed them with trehalose, which is the sugar mainly found in insects. And then after I fed them, I took some measurements of their blood glucose using a glucometer. And basically I did this at different time points so I could build these sugar tolerance curves. And here you can see in the x-axis the different time points where I took these measurements, and also in the y-axis with the blood glucose levels. And this is kind of color-coded by, let's say, the different sugars found in their diets. And here, what we can see is mainly when we see an increase on the blood glucose levels, then we're seeing the absorption through the intestine that I told you about some slides ago. And then when we see a decrease in the blood glucose levels, it's because the sugar is leaving the blood and it's going to the tissues where energy is needed or it's excreted to. So we have the background now, and these were my results. And we basically found that bats are better at assimilating the sugars that are predominantly found in their natural diets, which makes completely sense. But this is a huge graph, so I'm gonna break it down for you. So in the x-axis, we still have the measurements, so the time points where I took these blood glucose levels. In the y-axis, we have the blood glucose levels itself. And here in the top, we have the different diets of the bats. And in the right, you can see the different sugars in rows. So first trehalose, the one found in insects, then sucrose, and then glucose, these found in nectar and fruits. And the different colors are representing different genera. So let's break it down a little bit. And what we basically found is that the bats that ingest lots of insects, like insectivorous bats and some omnivorous bats, are showing the higher assimilation of trehalose, but it's still a low assimilation. And then with frugivores and nectarivores, these were the ones that assimilated the most of sucrose and glucose compared to the other diets. So basically, frugivorous and nectarivorous bats are great at assimilating the sugars found in nectar and fruits. And this makes sense because this is what they eat. And they are not as good at assimilating the sugar found in insects. And insectivorous bats can assimilate the sugar found in insects. However, this takes more time and the assimilation is kind of low. And this could be related to the fact that their diet is mostly composed by proteins and lipids instead of high amounts of sugar. But then after answering these, I was still wondering what was happening at the intestinal level, since this is the step where the nutrients are going to be like break down and absorbed. This absorption process is a really key one. So while I was a research scholar at the Stawrence Institute for Medical Research, we pursued this question. I basically extracted the intestine of many bats that were housed in museums, and I measured their length. But first, I was struck by the diversity of these intestines. Some are bigger than others because the size of these species change, and the disposition of the intestine was different. The morphology of the stomach was different. So that was really cool to see. And I basically focused on the first portion of the intestine, which is called the duodenum. And what we found is that there is a longer duodenum in bats with rich sugar diets that we can see right here. And then we wanted to look closer. So we did some cross sections of the intestine, and we basically looked at it under a microscope. So when we do a cross section of the intestine, this is what we can see. And when we color it too, when we stain it. So here in white, we're going to see the lumen, like the interior of the intestine. And then here, these projections are going to be the villi. And this is basically how the enterocytes or epithelial cells are organized inside of our intestines. And we saw different epithelial cell arrangements in the bats with different diets. So these finger-like villi, we mostly saw them in insectivorous bats. Then in nectivorous bats, we saw kind of like villi with these entrances and maybe some gaps in the middle, having like more surface area covered by epithelial cells, or these zigzag-like villi, which other researchers have found too. And this is basically just increasing the potential absorptive area. So that was really cool to see. And then what we did was to measure the absorptive area in the duodenum of the bats. And what we found is that bats with rich sugar diets have higher absorptive area. So frugivores and nectarivores have higher of this potential absorptive area for absorbing the nutrients, right? And then we wanted to look closer. So we look at the villi, and then we went, we magnified it, and we looked at the enterocytes, so the epithelial cells that are here, the dark purple dots. And we also looked at the brush border of these enterocytes, so the microvilli, where I told you the enzymes and transporters are going to be located. And what we found is that there was more microvilli and villi in the duodenum of bats with rich sugar diets. So like these nectar-feeding bats, these nectar and frugivore bats. And basically the results of the in vivo physiology, so the sugar tolerance curves are matching what we saw in the intestine morphology of the bats, where bats with rich sugar diets were showing higher glucose assimilation that was faster. And then the bats with frugivorous and nectarivorous diets were also showing higher intestinal absorptive area. So this was really, really cool to see. And yeah, I think with this, I would like to thank you for being here today. And I will be happy to take your questions or go back to any slide that you missed the QR code or.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea. And yeah,
Of
we've
course.
we've got time for questions. So does anyone have any questions? If so, you can feel free to raise your hand, or put your question into the chat if you would rather do that, and then I can read them out. Um, I guess like just to kind of get things started, and this is a very like I don't want to say a simple question, just as simple as saying, "What's your favorite bat?" Uh, what is, as you've been going through your research and study and learning all about this, what is one of the coolest things that you have learned about how I guess, the diets of bats? What is one of the things where you're like, wow, I learned this and that is just so cool?
About the diets of bats. I think that while I was doing my study, and also traveling doing other studies, related to my study, was to see that there are different responses on sugar assimilation, let's say in the same species living in different ecosystems and different countries. And this also allowed me to see differences in their kind of like personalities too. So it was really cool to see, for example, Phyllostom this color in my hometown, which is kind of like a dry tropical forest, not being able to assimilate sugar as much as Phyllostom this color in Costa Rica that lived in banana plantations and that had a lot of sugar resources to take. And this is an omnivorous bat. So see these differences based also in what's around them and their responses to the environment, I think are really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's something I think about, especially whenever we started to learn more about pallid bats and how they're,
Yes.
like pallid bats it's like widely been accepted. Like, they're eating insects, they're eating scorpions off the ground. But then I think it
Mhm.
was just within the last few years, and like correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think it's just in the last few years that we found out that they are also eating nectar to some extent as well and helping with the
Yeah.
pollination of desert plants.
Yes, that's crazy. And yeah, I've been wanting to see how they're assimilating lecture. Like how, yeah, how how are they
Exactly.
doing? And
How?
if,
How?
yeah, how? And that if some populations that might not feed on nectar are responding differently to the ones that do. Yeah, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, because they have a pretty wide range too. So I wonder
Hmm.
about some of these more omnivorous types of bats that do have these wide ranges, like the pallid bat, the ones
Yeah.
in, because I think that they range even all the way up into southern Canada on the western side of the country, which I don't think that there's probably a lot of things for them to feed on nectar wise here.
Yeah.
Versus the ones in like the southwestern and in the deserts of the Southwest and northern Mexico. I
Hmm.
wonder
Yeah.
how their physiologies
How?
differ. Like
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's crazy. I've been wanting to look into that. Yeah, for sure.
postdoc.
Yeah. That would be super fun.
All right. Well, we did have a comment in the chat. Oh, here we go. We do have a comment from Vicky in the chat. Did you study anything about the fruit-eating bats and their lives? I have rosettes. I hope I have never read that name before, so I apologize if I said it wrong. And they seem to have liver disease. We don't give them fruits with high vitamin C, but still seem to have liver issues.
Oh. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not sure about the liver disease or where that might be coming from. Um, it's really interesting. I might have to look more into that. And oof, I will put my I don't know where the chat is, but I will put my email there. And if you want, you can contact me, and then I could look further into this, and maybe we can talk about it. But yeah, I'm not sure what is happening with their liver if they're not consuming like lots of sugar. Um, yeah, I'm just wondering
Oh,
what's
and they
happening with there.
Vicky specified they are Egyptian fruit bats.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I'm not really sure about how these theropods are dealing with their sugar. There is a friend that is working on it, Jerica. She might be able to answer these questions. But yeah, I've mostly worked with neotropical bats. Um, but yeah, I'm not a lot working on the disease part of things regarding the liver. I'm sorry, but yeah, I'll put my contact information in the chat, and if you want, I could also connect you to Jerica.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, then I think we can sign off for today. So, again, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being our speaker today. And again, if you are interested in next month's talk, we are going to be focusing on social interactions and likely with a large emphasis on vampire bats because Dr. Gerald Carter has been working on them for quite some time. So I assume that's where we're going to get a lot of information from. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And we will go ahead and sign off for today. So have a good
Thank
rest
you,
of your,
Dana.
absolutely, absolutely. And have a good rest of the morning, rest of the afternoon, or the rest of the evening, or maybe even to some good night. All right. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.